Good morning, everybody. You're all very welcome to EU Green Week 2020 and to this virtual workshop 5.2, which is on the power of people. How can we live better, lighter and closer to nature? I'm Karen Coleman. I'm a journalist and a broadcaster from Ireland, and it's my pleasure to be moderating this morning's session. We've got a great lineup of speakers, so I think you're going to really enjoy this session. Now, I just want to go through a couple of housekeeping issues before I introduce the session and our guests. This is especially relevant for those of you who may only be coming onto the workshops for the first time and may be unfamiliar with the platform. So for those of you looking at the session online, if you want to enlarge your screen showing this session, then click on the button with the 4 arrows at the bottom of the stage on your screen. It's on the right-hand side as you look at the screen. During the session, we hope to take some of your questions. And if you would like to submit a question, then you need to press the question mark symbol on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. We have a busy session. We'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible, but the speakers also will have the option to answer some of your questions directly through the reply segment of the participants' question box. You also have an option to chat with your fellow participants watching the same session, and you can do that by going through the Join Chat button, which is on the left-hand side at the bottom of the stage screen. Please, to all of our great speakers who will be joining us for this session, can I remind you again to keep your microphones on mute unless I call out to you and when it's your time to speak. Now, so let's move on. And as I said, the session this morning is called The Power of People. How can we live better, lighter and closer to nature? And I'll just give you a little bit of context to the session. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that the unprecedented events we are witnessing and experiencing right now, they're all making many of us reevaluate how we live. And in a world under threat from global health concerns, economic challenges and biodiversity loss and climate change, our living and lifestyle decisions will collectively determine our future. So bearing that in mind, during the session, we'll be exploring how we can find new ways to live healthier and better lives that have a lighter footprint. We'll explore what exactly sustainable living means, especially in this era of COVID-19. And we'll be looking at how media and cultural influencers can motivate transformational change. So our speakers for this morning's session are Serenella Sala, Deputy Head of Unit with the European Commission's Joint Research Centre, Directorate D, Sustainable Resources. Dr. Lewis Akenji, lead author of the 1.5 Degree Lifestyles Report. Garrett Clark, the UN Environment Programme Sustainable Lifestyles Programme Officer. Claire Tavernier, Senior Media and Digital Advisor. And finally, Marie-Claire Graff, Youth Activist with Youngo Focal Point at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. So, we have a busy session ahead. Welcome to all of our great speakers online. Let's get started. And I'd like to go now to our first speaker, Serenella Sala, as I said, Deputy Head of Unit with the European Commission's Joint Research Centre, Directorate D, Sustainable Resources. Serenella is an environmental scientist, and she's been coordinating a project on the assessment of the environmental impact of consumption in the EU. Serenella now is going to introduce really the panel context and talk about how the impacts people's lifestyles are having on nature and biodiversity in terms of, for example, food, mobility, housing, leisure, etc. Serenella, you're very welcome, and I'm going to hand over this virtual stage to you.
Good morning to everybody. Thank you for inviting me to this very interesting discussion on the role of our lifestyle for a better environment. So my presentation is aiming to let you understand which are the means we have now in the scientific domain to be able to understand how much our lifestyle affects the planet health. As you all know, all the system of production, of consumption, which is today in place, especially in developed countries, That means the amount of food that we are eating and throwing away, our means of mobility, the way we are living in our houses, the products that we are buying, and in many cases we are over consuming, are creating dramatic impacts, not only on climate change, but also in terms of pressures, of pollution that is emitted, the amount of chemicals we release every day, the amount of plastics that we leave in the environment, the amount of nutrients like fertilizers that are used to sustain the agriculture and the food production. And this is leading not only to impacts related to climate, like the extreme weather events or the pandemic that we are experiencing in these days, but also a number of impacts on the environment, specifically on species, on ecosystem, on the habitat and biodiversity loss associated with that. At European level now, all these concerns are very central in the European Green Deal. And what us as scientists are asked more and more is to unveil the link between what we choose every day to consume and the impacts that we generate. So I'm the responsible of a project in the European Commission, which is called Consumer Footprint, which aims at assessing this link between consumption choices, consumption behavior, and the impacts in the environment. We do that by means of a method which is called life cycle assessment, which is looking at the impacts of a product from the extraction of raw material to the end of life. That means the waste management, so the final stages that also are influenced by our behavior. So if we decide to make a separate collection or not. And we do that by means of selecting a number of representative products, which are a selection of those that represent better lifestyle and consumption patterns. And we look mainly at 5 areas of consumption: food, mobility, housing, household goods, and appliances, and all the devices that more and more we are consuming. Based on our studies, we were able to cover 16 different environmental impacts. They are a bit small, I hope you can see, but they span from climate change to eutrophication, so the amount of nutrients we are releasing in the environment, to ecotoxicity, so the chemicals that we are using and releasing affecting the environment. And these color bar that you see, green, yellow, and red, represent basically the safe area of planetary health, an area of uncertainty, that is the yellow, and an area of red, which is we are already surpassing what the heart can sustain. And for many of the impact categories, we are well beyond the yellow to red limits, and in some cases even 10 times more, like for the case of climate change. That means that we need to reduce our footprint on the environment of 1 order of magnitude. And this means understanding which are the key areas on which we have to act. If we look to the same areas of consumption with the eyes of the contribution to biodiversity loss, we can identify that food alone is responsible of 55% of the overall biodiversity impact due to EU consumption. That means that selecting the food we are eating, but also being able to reduce the amount of food waste that we produce, it's very central. And this may reduce the amount of pressure we are having on climate change and land use, which are important driver of biodiversity loss. Also, other components of our consumption are of concern, like the housing. We are having now all the technologies available to live in house that are consuming less energy. And this is important. It's a transition that is very much needed and technically feasible. Then there is the issue of the mobility. Of course, now with the COVID situation, our mobility is very much constrained, but the areas of consumption mobility over the last 10 years was the areas of consumption experiences the highest increase. So we have really to think again on the system we move ourselves and also our goods are moved. And then on the household goods and on the appliances, this is very much linked with our capability to have a self-sufficiency in the consumption. So to avoid overconsumption, to go for durability of the products that we buy and consume. So to help each consumer to understand which his own lifestyle, how he or she may affect the environment, we are about to launch a consumer footprint calculator that will enable a citizen to introduce information on the products they are consuming, the frequency of consumption, the intensity of the consumption, and understanding each of the 16 environmental impact that we look at, including biodiversity, and including the possibility of understanding if an average citizen today is in the red area, so overcoming the planetary boundaries, is instead with your individual lifestyle, you can be in the yellow or in the green bar. And this also helping understanding which are the specific areas of consumption that characterize your own lifestyle. And this, I think, it's of tremendous importance to increase the awareness not only on the big environmental concern that we have at global scale that sometimes seems so distant from our daily life, but really to have this link between our choice today and the effect on the environment. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Serenella. That was really excellent and I think gives us a really good context for the rest of the panel debate. By the way, if you're just joining us, you're very welcome. I'm Karen Coleman, a journalist and a broadcaster from Ireland, and I'm moderating this particular workshop session, which is The Power of People. How can we live better, lighter and closer to nature? So Serenella there set out some really good points for the rest of the discussion. So let's now move to our next speaker. Dr. Lewis Ikenji is the lead author of the 1.5 degree lifestyles report, targets and options for reducing lifestyle carbon footprints. Lewis is the executive director of SEED, a UN partnership organization supporting climate change entrepreneurship. And prior to that, he was the director for sustainable consumption and production at the think tank IGES. And I have to tell you that if you get an email from Lewis, it has a sign off that says, "Laugh often and out loud. It's healing and contagious," which I think is brilliant. I'm going to borrow that from you, Lewis, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Please feel free to use it. Sharing is caring. And thank you everyone for participating here today, and to the fellow panelists. I like so much something that Serenella said. We have all the technology to have sustainable households today or sustainable houses today. Why are we not using it? And I would argue that this is an issue of translation, translating what we have to what we actually could be doing with it in practice. So before I get started with the 1.5 degree lifestyles, it is worth touching a bit on COVID-19, given that we are buried in a pandemic right now. And what we're seeing is that health systems are very fragile, the health systems that we've depended upon. Social safety nets are wobbling. There's a lot of talk about poverty or the middle class falling off. And the community, the basis upon which we interact with each other every day, is community engagement is really falling. So our ability to reach out to each other, to talk to each other, and to be with each other is really threatened. What we're seeing here is a number of things, and it is worth understanding this in the context of lifestyles. One, the systems that we set up are very important. Two, the trust that we build between people in society and their everyday living, and the systems that operate and allow them to go about everyday living is quite important. And 3, leadership is very critical. A lot of that means confusion in society. Nobody knows who to trust anymore. And you see what we're seeing now in times of COVID, where we have people arguing with scientists or with authorities and so on, and nobody really knows who to follow. So how does this translate to lifestyles? First, I would talk a little bit about 3 key things. 1, the magnitude of the issue, which we don't always tend to recognize. 2, the intersection between issues of sustainable lifestyles and inequality or social justice. And 3, the question of whether we look at it from an individual perspective or from a structural perspective. What we've done with a 1.5 degree lifestyles report is to look at the IPCC targets for 2050 and ask the question, what is the potential contribution of lifestyles if we have to meet this target? And we've come up with the unit called Lifestyle Carbon Footprint, which is looking at greenhouse gas emissions directly emitted or indirectly induced from household and individual consumption, but excluding capital formation and government expenditure. So it really locks into the lifestyles perspective. And the targets, based on today's 4.6 tons of CO2 equivalents per person per year, the targets are that we need to be at 2.5 tons by 2030, 1.4 tons by 2040, and about 0.7 tons per person per year by 2050. How big is this? Take a country like Belgium. It is currently at 12.2 tons, which means that within the next 10 years, it needs to cut down by 79%. And in 50 years, it needs to cut down by 90% in its lifestyle carbon footprint. Belgium is is a bit higher up there, but take Finland, which is not too high up there and it's not too low down there, which is about 10.4. It needs to cut by more than 85% by 2050. This is the magnitude that we're ignoring when we talk about lifestyles or the contribution of sustainable lifestyles in a very passive way, which then asks the question, how do we make sure that at a systems level, this transitioning is encompassing all of those infrastructural aspects, policy aspects that Serenella so very well articulated. The second one that I think is becoming very evident is the issue of social justice here and inequality. What we did with setting the targets was looking at it on an equity basis across the globe. So the American, for example, doesn't have more CO2 budget than, say, the South African or the Cameroonian. And we see that already by given today's emissions, by 2050, China needs to cut down by 70%, India needs to cut by 40%, and Brazil by more than 60%. These are economies that still need to get billions of people out of poverty. And so the issue of social justice, inequality, and how we're translating these targets globally becomes quite central, especially if you're a European citizen or part of one of the governments in the European Union. The last but not the least point, which I think is quite important, is the often made argument of whether it's individual or systemic change. Who makes the change first? And I would argue that this is a false dichotomy. Of course, we need individuals to make changes. These changes in individuals sort of start habituating them to the context of 1.5 living and what future society or everyday lives could look like. They're also important because encouraging changes at individual level allows for a certain buy-in for the larger changes that need to be made by governments. It also allows for recognition for the need for very drastic policy measures and investments in new infrastructure. However, ultimately, to make sure that the default option is the sustainable lifestyles option, it is not just something that can be surrendered to the individuals and households. It is something that needs articulation by the government in terms of how, on the one hand, it works with policymakers and businesses, how it sets the policy framework, how it gets the economic conditions viable for the more sustainable options to flourish, but also how it's investing in future infrastructure for food, mobility, housing, and looking at systems of provisioning upon which people depend every day. Until this change, the scale and the magnitude we're talking about is going to be very difficult, and we'll see so much more confusion than we're seeing in the days of COVID-19. So I will leave it at that for now, and I hope we can revisit some of this later on in the discussion. Thank you.
Lewis, thank you so much. Really, really good. Some very pertinent points there and some very scary figures as well that you're giving. By the way, if you do want to put a question to Lewis, we hope that we will be able to put your questions to our panelists. Do please go to the question box on your screen and submit your question. Now, my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Garrett Clark is the UNEP's Sustainable Lifestyles Programme Officer. With a sustainability career spanning over 30 years, Garrett's expertise lies in promoting how we can live better and lighter, technically referred to as sustainable consumption and production. And Garrett now leads the UN Environment's work to support a shift to move to more sustainable lifestyles, which promote better living through how we eat, move, live, buy stuff, and handle our money, etc. So over to you, Garrett, with this question. We know what to do. So why does it get lost in the noise? What are the myths around communicating sustainability?
Thank you so much, Karen, and thanks to the panelists and welcome to all the viewers. In this COVID context, we've all heard about the importance of putting people at the center of how we build back better. Now, whether that's at the global, the regional, national, or even local levels. But perhaps most importantly, we have all lived this in our homes. Google during confinement, when most of the planet was affected, and noted that there was an increase in the search stream of sustainable living, an increase of over 4,500%. Now, that was only for those words. Imagine all the words that we use on a daily basis or concepts that we follow when we're making our daily decisions about how we live. And during COVID, we're noticing an even increase in how we are living through health and our well-being. But in reality, people do not wake up in the morning and strive to save energy or resources or think about the environment. They don't think about hurting it, but they don't think about helping it either. And even though there is a growing awareness, and I'm assuming many of the people who are on the webinar today are also very interested in this topic, most people on the planet wake up and make decisions about their lives, now more than ever about health. They think about what to eat, how to get around, what they need, how to spend time with family, friends, and their community. They live their lives and aspirations as best they can. And today the challenges are even greater than ever, even to survive for many. So building on the presentations of Saranella and Lewis, which touch upon the evidence and context behind what's happening with lifestyles, let's also look at some of the, I won't call it myths, but let's look at a little bit of the lack of clarity around sustainable living, because we hear these terms a lot in the media. And imagine if you're working in sustainability, they may resonate with you, but someone who's not familiar with sustainability, to them, it may mean everything or nothing. But just to highlight some key points that research has shown is that there is no one sustainable lifestyle. Living more sustainably in Paris, Bangkok, Nairobi, whether you're in an urban or rural environment, depends on your age, your culture, hence lifestyles vary. They are holistic and evolve over time, and they cover all facets of our lives. So if we focus only on making changes in mobility or housing or food and fashion, we're not going to be doing the trick in the long run. Lifestyle enhancement, like our lives, needs to be seen in a context as an ongoing process of change. So let's also look at what is currently influencing our lifestyle behavior. I mean, just as an example, advertising and marketing, which since the Second World War has supported a more linear, consumption-driven economy, it speaks to the hopes and values and aspirations of a mainstream audience and spends over $700 billion worldwide. Imagine advertising doesn't give people another problem that they don't want. It gives them desirable options to problems that they have now. How can we find transferable lessons that can help incentivize and motivate evidence-based behavior to embrace more sustainable change? Now, finally, we also need to look at who to focus on, because the Earth is a big place. We have a lot of work to do. Resources are limited. Consider that 2 to the 3 billion new consumers coming online are going to be urban youth who are setting consumption trends now, but will be tomorrow's leaders. and that many, an increasing over 50%, close to 90% in some, get their information from social media. And let's not forget about governments and businesses. As referenced by Lewis, they are consumers too. And in fact, they are better placed more effectively in an upstream position in value chains to redesign how best to meet societal and individual needs and aspirations and make the systemic changes we needed. But let's get back to people. Let's remember that even those who want to live more sustainably probably don't have the options that are affordable, accessible, effective, or desirable. And again, that gets back to the role of governments and business to make sustainable living more of a default option. But there is a way forward. And there is increasing evidence. We heard some of it this morning. There is evidence on what people can do in their daily lives. We need to better bridge the evidence to actionable ways in which people and the organizations and institutions and systems that work with people can make more concrete action. As one example, UNEP, working in partnership, developed the Anatomy of Action. It's an evidence-based initiative that outlines the 5 major domain areas that were referenced by Saranella and Lewis and highlight the concrete steps people can take. I invite you to check it out and see what you can do in your daily life and also within your organization. Okay, so with all this evidence, why isn't this disruptive need change happening? So my final points are going to quickly look at the evidence and research that is coming out that can help debunk some of the myths around communicating and sustainability. Now, for many of us in sustainability, these aren't going to be a surprise, but after years, the evidence is in and the proof is there. It's taken from work that is coming on an upcoming report called Reducing Plastic Pollution, Campaigns That Work, that was developed by the Stockholm Environment Institute along with UNEP, and is a contribution to the One Planet Network-wide Plastics Initiative. The first myth, information is power. Information will result in action. Well, not really. Raising awareness is really important, but it doesn't necessarily determine behavior change. Why? Because unsustainable practices remain practical and convenient for our consumption choices. And as I mentioned, people don't necessarily make decisions with sustainability in mind. They buy on price, availability, effectiveness, and other factors around health, culture, whether it's cool, and maybe sustainability. How can we upscale that? What does work? Communicating specific, actionable, meaningful steps that people can take using easy messages, evidence-based, that are delivered close to the time when the decision happens. Now, the second myth, guilt and fear change behavior. Well, I think we're all comfortable understanding that, in fact, it's the contrary. Sometimes information and campaigns that are shocking and terrifying or overwhelming can make people feel terrible and dismissive, hopeless, dumb, and not able to listen over time. What does work are appeals to positive social norms that reinforce behavior and emotions like pride, optimism, hope, and even love and humor. Myth 3, people change for the greater good. Well, in reality, people actually behave more in line with their immediate context and discount their ability to make a difference. People act when they feel personally relevant and near-term options, and thus local or more customized campaigns that can create a connection or emphasize immediacy and reference tangible impacts work a lot better than altruistic appeals. Now, the fourth myth, which goes back to about sustainable lifestyles, is that there's one size that fits all. As noted, since there's no one sustainable lifestyle, people respond differently based on where they are, their context, and need to have campaigns or information that keeps this in mind and doesn't alienate other groups, but targets perhaps transition points in lifestyles, like when you're retiring or having a family, when people are more open to rethink how they're making their daily decisions. As a final point to summarize, though many in the sustainability field have felt that if people had the right information, they would do the right thing, it may be more accurate for people who share the same worldview, but we need to scale up and have behavior change in the mainstream. So we're going to have to need and rethink how we reach out and better tie the evidence, bridge the evidence into how people can be engaged and motivated for change. Thank you.
Okay, Garrett, very good points. And I think that especially, when you talk about information and communications, they segue very well to our next speaker. And can I introduce now Claire Tavernier? She's a senior media and digital advisor, and with over 20 years track record in growing commercially and creatively successful media and digital businesses, Claire now advises businesses and non-profit organizations on media and digital strategies. She also sits on various boards, including the British Board of Film Classification. Claire, a question for you. We've heard a lot from Garrett now about information and media and content and trying to get the message out. What do you think the media have to do to get people to change? Over to you, Claire.
Thank you very much, Karen. And as you say, great introduction by Garrett. I should start by saying that I know very little about sustainable living, but I do know a lot about media and storytelling. And the first thing to say really is that stories are essential because stories are how we relate to things. We learn to understand life through stories as children, and we still do today. As an example, Little Red Riding Hood is a story many of you know about stranger danger. You could have a PSA about not going into the woods alone or not talking to strangers, even if they look like your grandma. Or you can tell a story about a little girl being eaten by someone who looked like a nice granny, and then that work is done. And this story exists in most cultures, although sometimes the wolf is a tiger. Another more recent example, of course, is the lockdown, to which we related mostly through stories of neighbors getting together, stories of celebrities with gray hair, stories of exhausted frontline workers. We went into lockdown before because of the government, but we stayed because of an emotional connection. Stories work at 3 different levels to connect us to issues. As Garrett mentioned, they build awareness, and that's important. They humanize and allow space to discuss complex issues, and then ultimately they normalize behaviors. Now, building awareness is often where charities and NGOs and government agencies stop when they think media. It's done with celebrities, influencers, ambassadors, and awareness is good, but it's not enough, and we've just heard it. Influencers will make you aware, they may even make you care, but their sponsoring of a cause is very unlikely to make you change your behavior dramatically. For this, we need a bit more space. We need longer, more in-depth stories. We need books, movies, TV series. Think of your favorite soap and think about a storyline that's made you think twice. A movie like Pink in India has now been used by the police to train them on women's rights. Pink, which is the story of a young woman who gets raped, makes the victim connect emotionally with the victim, with the woman, in a new way. It makes them stop and think, and it allows the space to have conversations on the movie that really reflects the conversations that would happen in the living room at the same time. Soap operas in Europe and Australia have been trailblazers in running sensitive storylines that need time and space to be explored. Recently in the UK, Coronation Street, a very famous soap, ran a storyline on coercive control, which is a very complicated issue. But because of the format, they were able to run the whole conversation. Is it abuse? There's no physical abuse. Why doesn't she leave? They were able to give the space to the issues, and they took the listeners and the viewers on a journey. Again, recently, the lockdown during the pandemic was humanized by stories of frontline workers, nurses, doctors. Those people even made the cover of Vogue magazine. Vogue didn't put the virus on its front page. It's the stories of the heroes that people wanted. Stories matter. People need to know why they're doing something. And this is essential for this issue of sustainable living because it is such a complex issue. There is not one sustainable lifestyle. We've just heard it, and it varies and it changes. It's complicated. People don't feel that they have power over it. And for some, it is about changing consumptions that they quite like. So it's really important to understand, for people to understand why they're doing it. And they needs to be talked through and understood across not, a seminar, although this is lovely, but across days and weeks and through characters that they care about. And why this? It is so that we can move to the next level, which Garrett also mentioned, which is this idea of changing norms and behaviors. And at their best, stories can create and influence new social norms. Once an issue has been raised and discussed and humanized, it can become normalized. Do you remember James Bond around 1962? He was a chain-smoking, heavy-drinking, sports cars driving, sexist, racist, homophobic hero. He's not that anymore. He doesn't smoke, he never drinks and drive, and consent is very clearly asked before he tumbles Monica Bellucci into bed. Moneypenny is black, M was a woman, and Q is younger than James. James Bond movies, that ultimate action hero, franchise, is used to glamorize and normalize a certain kind of behaviors, and now, following a change in society, they've pivoted to new norms. The influence of smoking on screen in particular, this is something that's been studied, and it's been demonstrated that both its presence on screen and its absence, even if not explained or not mentioned, have a big impact on viewers. For sustainable living here, it's about changing social norms so that sustainable living becomes the default option, not the different, bewildering, and complex one. So in the same way that non-smoking, multiracial society and sober driving have thankfully become the default option on our screens. And yet, right now, normal behavior on TV is for cool people to have a large disposable cup of coffee with them. That's a short code. In American series in particular, it's for, I'm a really busy person, I have a big Starbucks cup. Success is driving a massive SUV. Water is drunk from a bottle. Shopping is done in large supermarkets. But story can change that. Let's normalize this sustainable behavior. Let's make it accessible. Let's make it normal. Let's make it visible. Let's show people downsizing, growing their own vegetables, drinking tap water, working from home. We've seen a lot of that. Stories can help us relate to think, and they guide us in theory and potentially towards better choices. So my final point to you is we need to develop the Little Red Riding Hood of sustainable living now. Thank you very much.
You very much, Claire. That's just fantastic. I told you, for those of you watching us online, you'd really enjoy this session. Super stuff, and coming on the back of, some excellent speakers before you. And as a journalist, we're constantly grappling with how do you make a story that could be boring really, really interesting. And your whole point about stories is so pertinent. So thank you so much for that. And indeed, going back to Garrett, during her presentation, she talked about the urban youth and setting trends for the future. So it's a real pleasure now to introduce somebody who comes from that generation who will be so influential in the future. Marie-Claire Graff is a youth activist with Yongo focal point at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. It's a long acronym. And Yongo is the youth constituency of the UNFCCC. And just a little bit of background about Marie-Claire. She's a Swedish youth activist for climate change, so she's in good company. She's engaged in several initiatives on a local, national and international level. And Marie-Claire believes that youth and future generations are the recipients of today's decisions. Therefore, it is her goal to empower them to take meaningful actions to create a momentum for change to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So, Marie-Claire, a question for you. How are youth activists, the new policy wildcards, contributing to change? Over to you, Marie-Claire. Marie-Claire, can you hear me? Is your microphone unmuted? Just unmute your microphone so that we can make sure you're still with us. Now, are we having difficulty with Marie-Claire's microphone and line? Okay, so Marie-Claire, what I'm going to suggest to you is I'm going to call out to you again now. This is a very glitchy system. So I'm just going to give you a couple of seconds. Are you hearing me? Is your mic unmuted? And can you call into us and say hello?
Can you hear me?
Very good. Okay, Marie-Claire, over to you. My question again to you was, how are youth activists, the new policy wildcards, contributing to change? Over to you, Marie-Claire.
Thank you. And I knew there is something going wrong today, but until now it worked. And just to clarify, I'm actually from Switzerland and not from Sweden. But yeah, I'm sharing my activism with Greta, and yeah, thank you so much. Great to start the day with so much inspiration. And normally I would ask who already participated in the climate strikes, but now I can't ask right now. So let me assume some today. around the world. So the question is, can you hear me?
I'm just going to come back in again there, Marie-Claire, and apologies, I had notes that you were Swedish, but you're Swiss, so we clarify that, which is good. Your line is a little bit dodgy, and Claire, you came in there for a moment. So can I just ask all the rest of our speakers, bar Marie-Claire, if you could please put your microphone on mute. Marie-Claire, we're going to have another go, so I'm going to go back to you again now. Thank you. Just continue with your presentation.
Let me see if my line is stable. Otherwise, I am going to change the Wi-Fi, but actually it should be working. So yeah, normally I would ask who already joined the climate strike and participated and took to the streets, but I can't ask this right now, but let me assume some of you already. The question here is, what has youth activism and climate strikes to do with lifestyles? Okay. If I'm not audible, like, let me know. So, well, you probably all experienced already that it's sometimes really hard to live a sustainable lifestyle, and you probably already annoyed when you like had to do some choices in a supermarket, or like when you're flying or take the train, and it's sometimes very complicated and also expensive, and it is not really accessible and also not inclusive. So when I gave up flying in Europe, because we have a more or less good train system, I was confronted with so many challenges. It is not only about the money and about the timing. Okay, then let's go on, and I'm trying to switch my Wi-Fi.
If I can just interrupt, Marie-Claire, the actual system you were on was working at the moment. If I can recommend, don't change your system. Just leave it as it is, because it seems to be working, and just pick up your presentation from where you left off. So just back to you again, Marie-Claire.
Well, maybe here it's better. Let me see. Yeah, so I have just been mentioning that it is very challenging. For example, when you're giving up flying and you want to take the train across Europe, and there are many challenges coming with money, timing, but also the support system, the hotline, the refunds, or just the train not coming. So for me, this is, of course, was a lot of fun, but this is not what an average EU citizen is expecting from the 21st century. So lifestyle has a lot to do actually with the climate strikes. And that's also why I want to go a little bit deeper. And that's also why I'm very thankful that the voice of young people is included in this panel.
Okay. Marie-Claire, I'm sorry, but the line really is very poor right now. So what I'm going to suggest is that maybe you get yourself on a more stable internet line, and take a few minutes to do that. And maybe Estelle, who is one of the technical people in the background, if you can help Marie-Claire to come back in a new line, and we will go back to her. So what we'll do in the meantime, though, while Marie-Claire is getting herself sorted, there have been a number of you submitting questions, and you can continue to submit questions. And I'm going to go to those questions now while Marie-Claire is getting the line sorted, and look at some of them. Very, very good. Lots and lots of questions coming in. Maybe if I can go to you, Lewis. There's a question here from Ella Finch, I believe. Thank you very much for your question, Ella. For Lewis, given the urgency and magnitude of the change that needs to happen, what are the ways we can encourage our local and national governments to act on implementing sustainable measures? Very good question. Lewis, could you perhaps answer that question?
Thank you very much for the question, and thank you, Ella Finch. I do think the core of this question really goes to the core of why we're doing this sort of research or policy research, and it speaks to the options that are out there. One thing I would go right into is talking about the absence of experimentation in today's context. It almost seems like we're always constantly waiting for finally packaged and excellent solutions before we deploy them, which is quite a mistake, because our entire civilization is built on experimentation, getting big, bold ideas and then moving them forward. And we have lots of big, bold ideas today on energy, on community engagement, on design and architecture, on mobility systems, we're simply not deploying them, either because we're captured by the economic growth mentality, or because we do not necessarily think there's a receptive audience out there to go after such lifestyles. So one thing we could already start doing is asking for governments for the budget to always get justified that it is being spent on future-proof infrastructure. If your infrastructure is not 1.5 degree viable, there's no point in government. It could be national governments, it could be municipalities. There's no point in it spending money there. We also need to start rethinking how we're evaluating how the infrastructures and policies that we're putting in place are responding to the human needs for well-being, the human needs for community building, and so on. And so I would suggest one way of encouraging this is not only going through what we've seen in other countries as deliberative governance approaches, but looking and putting at the very center of this a well-being index for government planning and development. If we do not have a well-being index guiding how we're building our economies or how we're building our societies, then we get misguided into thinking a developed country or an industrialized country almost always means that people are happy in there. But there is one last thing I'd like to mention. There are very many good examples of very sustainable products that are out there in society. There are very good examples of sustainable ways of doing things. But for each one of these, there are hundreds or even thousands of unsustainable options that are more accessible, that seem to be packaged in more appealing ways, and that are even cheaper for people. So there's a few good, very, very good and solid examples that are subsumed in a sea of unsustainability options. What we need to do is to start looking at the choice architecture and looking at choice editing mechanisms that take out these bad options and start bringing in defaults in ways that are much more sustainable. If we can take these baby steps, or some of them giant steps, I think we're very easily articulating our way to a more sustainable future.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Lewis. I'm just going to quickly go back to Marie-Claire because I think she has, fingers crossed, stabilized her internet connection. Marie-Claire, back to you. And if you can very quickly wrap up on some of the points you wanted to make. I think we're having a lot of glitchy internet problems this morning. So Marie-Claire, can you hear me? Just going to go back.
You should be able to hear me right now, right?
Okay, we hear you now, so you can continue with your presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Great. Sorry for these technical issues. They always occur in the most inconvenient time. But what I wanted to say very quickly, that when we want to live a sustainable lifestyle, which is compatible with the 1.5 degrees goal and a 1.5 degrees world, we really have to also get political, and that's what we are demanding with our demands from the climate strike. They are all science-based, and one will actually think they're common sense. So what we are demanding is the most logic from our so-called leader. We want a safe future, and we want to live a sustainable lifestyle because we have the right to a healthy environment. So as also, for example, Professor Genevieve has said, that pressure movements, for example, climate strikes or demonstrations, are very important because if we are mobilizing at least 3.5%, so only 3.5% of the population supporting the cause and the demands very actively, this has always brought along the change they wanted and the desires in history. So this is really encouraging that we can demand as average citizens our regulations to change towards a more sustainable lifestyles. So our demands are very simple, and taking the latest scientific reports into account. For example, the International Panel on Climate Change, the 1.5 report, which came actually out around 2 years ago, calling for unprecedented change of our current system. And so we have three major demands, and the first one is the climate emergency. And I think I can put this in light with the corona crisis, because only when we declare it as a crisis, which is in this case a pandemic, we could treat it accordingly. Because if there's is a crisis, but we are not treating it as such, we cannot mobilize the funds and the necessary regulations, the political power. So what we have to do is the first to see and to declare the climate crisis as a climate emergency. And then we can act upon, as we have been seen brilliantly by COVID. The second demand is net zero 2030 in order to have a slight chance to actually even make it for the 1.5 degrees of global warming, which already would have devastating effects. But also here, a small example when it comes to digitalization. So who has thought that we are able today to sit here from all over the world, not via Zoom, but via the Meet You application, and that we can all come together? And this was not imaginable for us some years ago, but today it's reality. So what we need is that everyone works on these goals. And if we declare the goals clear and simple, we have the Paris Agreement, we have the SDG agenda. So we have to go to net zero. And if all of us are putting the forces behind and stop the lobby for the business as usual, we can go and make it. But for this, we need the clear and binding targets as we are demanding by net zero 2030. And my last point about climate justice, which should be on the basis of us humanity, which are absolutely crucial, because this is what makes us as humanity strong, and this is also what makes our future sustainable. And then the last question is about the system change. A lot of people are asking, do you really want a system change? So if we achieve the climate emergency, the net zero by 2030 and climate justice in the current system, and with this be able to have a sustainable lifestyle, we are not going to blame the system, at least not from a climate perspective. But as long as this is not possible, and as long as it's so hard to live a sustainable lifestyle within the current system, we need to change the system accordingly. So my last point, when you haven't striked, I mean, now during Corona, it's a little bit hard, but nevertheless, you can make aware your company, wherever you are working, your family, your community, about these demands, and try to also incorporate in your sustainable lifestyle the political sphere and demands for a sustainable lifestyle and our future. Thank you, and I hope my internet was stable now.
Thank you very much, Marie-Claire, and it was great the way you dealt with the challenges of the internet. It is the world we live in, with online conferencing and all the sorts of things that can happen, but you did a brilliant job. We've just a limited amount of time to maybe put one or two questions to our panelists, and maybe I'm going to take one from one of the participants' questions, and thank you so much for all of the questions that you've been putting. And it's one really specifically, I suppose, for you, Claire, from Roberto Costantino. Roberto wants to know, do you know courses or materials to learn how to build stories to bring people closer to nature? Claire, maybe you could elaborate on that for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to make a plea here, which is to say, don't try to tell stories in the same way that you wouldn't want storytellers to become experts in sustainable living. Partner with people who know how to do this. Yes, of course, there are lots of courses, but actually it takes so much time and effort and years and decades of experience to learn how to tell beautiful stories. On the other hand, storytellers, screenwriters, people who work on these things are always incredibly hungry for issues and stories, and they're very, very open to working with people. I mean, usually, not always, of course, but usually these are really, really nice people who are very committed to trying to make a difference with, using their craft. And the soap example is a very good one, because actually writing a soap eats up an enormous amount of story. So soap writers tend to be always looking for the next big story to tell. But it's true as well of movies. One example, I think, is J.J. Abrams. When he took over the Star Wars franchise, some people will have views as to whether he did a good job or not. But one of the things he got exposed to, and he was very, very keen to push, was female empowerment. Actually, it was one of the issues that was given to him, and that led him to make the choices that he made. So I would say, of course, there are lots of courses, but I would urge you not to try to do it yourself, because it's difficult. And actually, the best stories are told in the context of bigger stories. They're just part of a larger story rather than being focused only on that theme, because that tends to become a sort of slightly preachy, not very engaging type of story. So absolutely go out and go to screenwriting courses, go to storytelling courses. There are lots of lovely ones, and it's a great, you'll learn a lot, but I would say that's not the most efficient way of doing it. The most efficient way of doing it would be to partner with people who do that for a living.
Claire, great insights there. Thank you very much for that. And maybe a question to you, Garrett. Who else do you think needs to be brought into all of this? I mean, do you have any game changer partners in mind?
Thanks, Karen. And actually, my response to that would sort of build on what Claire was just talking about, as well as what the panel has been covering in general. We've seen, especially around the COVID context, that what made a change was that the evidence was there was leadership, and then the final point was that more COVID conscious behavior became the norm. And I guess Claire was talking about how we can do a better job of making sustainable living the norm. And I would note that in addition, I referenced advertisers and marketers. Claire's talked about storytellers. Mary Claire is actually a youth influencer in herself, is that there's a huge role to be played to better bridge the evidence and policy to the way in which people are actually living their lives to make it desirable, possible, and accessible. And so I don't want to spend too much time. I know we're at the end of the webinar, but highlighting that the need we have is to make what a vision around what is sustainable living that's desirable, that works within the evidence of a 1.5 living context, and how can we make it a norm that is desirable to pursue.
And thank you so much for being able to wrap up a lot of points so quickly. Maybe finally, if I can go back to you, Saranella, maybe wrapping up two questions, and if you can answer them briefly. Michael, from I think Michael Alf, if that is the correct pronunciation, Michael, of your name, wants to know, how do we change the willingness of the masses to change their lifestyle? And maybe that ties in with, a question about insights in how to measure lifestyle changes and what are the indicators. Saranella, your comments perhaps on those 2 points.
Okay, maybe I start from the last, because of course the scientific let's say community is very active in trying to develop a more sophisticated approach to assess lifestyle. So beyond the footprinting that I presented, but also trying to capitalize on the big data that we are available in terms of really managing real data that may help us understanding how the consumption patterns are evolving. But then, of course, the central discussion this morning, and also the essence of the questions on how we change the willingness of the masses. There is an increased interest in behavioral focused policy. This is a sort of new era, a mindset shift also in the policy making, to understand how it's possible beyond the regulation and directive and legislation to nudge people towards this desirable and possible lifestyle that Garrett mentioned. This, I think, it's really an interdisciplinary challenge ahead of us. So making an environmental science with a behavioral scientist, with a storyteller, to work together cannot be done simply changing a law or a legislation.
And thank you very much, Saranella. And we'll just go very quickly to a question that came in from Christina. What is the most important thing to do? We cannot focus on everything. Maybe very quickly back to you, Lewis, for a final point on that question. Lewis, if you can hear me on that, if you can pick up on what's the most important thing to do, can't focus on everything. Back to you, Lewis.
Hello, thank you for that. I would say I would distinguish between a technical approach and a non-technical approach. One of the most important things we can focus on now is energy, getting our energy systems way more efficient, the energy that heats our homes or cools our homes or runs our vehicles and so on, much more efficient. But on the behavior side of it, we need to shift from start thinking of people as consumers, but thinking of them as people going about their everyday living and being a part of community and working towards well-being for each other. Once we get this articulated in our policies and in our systems, it really changes the dynamic of, instead of selling green products to them, we start looking at means of meeting everyday needs that allow for better and more equitable living.
Lewis, you did a brilliant job there, and thank you so much for that. And that really brings us to the end of this panel session. It's been great. I've had fun moderating it, and thank you so much for all those of you. I think we got over 100 people who were tuning in at one stage. Thank you so much for joining us for this panel debate. I hope you enjoy the rest of the workshops if you're going to be attending them too. And I want to give a big thanks now to our panelists for this morning's session, Serenella Sala, Lewis Akenji, Garrett Clark, Claire Tavernier, and Marie-Claire Graff. And a big thanks too to Laura from the UN, who works with Garrett, has been doing fabulous work behind the scenes, pulling this session together, and indeed to Estelle from the Teamwork technical team as well. Without these people, we'd never have these sessions up and running. Big thanks to you. So that's it from me. Enjoy the rest of your sessions, and I'll hopefully see you at another stage during the Green Week session. Thank you very much. Bye-bye now.